Welcome, friend. Tonight we explore a profound teaching in Zen Buddhism called the original face. It points toward who we truly are beneath everything we have become, and in recognizing it, we return to a quiet peace that was here all along. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Whether it is late at night in a quiet apartment, early morning before the world has fully awakened, or somewhere in between, you are welcome here. From our earliest moments, life begins to add layers. We are given a name. Someone looks at us and speaks a word, and that word becomes attached to us. We hear it again and again until it feels inseparable from who we are. Over time, the name becomes the first coat of paint on a canvas that was once completely bare. Then come other layers. We are told we are shy or bold, clever or slow, kind or difficult. We are taught what to believe, how to behave, what to strive for. We learn the roles we are expected to play: child, sibling, student, partner, parent. Year by year, these layers accumulate until we can hardly remember what was there before them. But beneath all these layers, something remains, something that has never changed. This is what the Zen tradition invites us to recognize tonight. Not something new to find, but something ancient to remember. Here at the long night, we move slowly. We allow silence to breathe between words. We let stories unfold at the pace of a quiet river, rather than the rush of a busy day. If this space feels comforting to you, you're always welcome to return, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you can join us again whenever you need a moment of stillness. Tonight will not be about complicated philosophy. It will not ask you to analyze or debate. Instead, we will explore this teaching through gentle stories and reflections. We will meet ordinary people who discovered in their own quiet ways what they had somehow always known. As you listen, you may begin to notice something softening inside you. The constant effort to become someone else. The subtle tension of trying to improve, to fix, to achieve. For a little while, you do not need to become anything. You are allowed to simply be. Before the first name was spoken over you, you were here. Before anyone told you who you were supposed to become, you already existed. That original presence did not need approval to be real. It did not need accomplishment to be worthy. It simply was complete and whole, needed nothing added. We will gently return to that recognition together. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders soften. Allow the weight of the day to settle. The search can rest for now, and in this quiet resting, we begin. There was a time before you knew your own name. A time before language wrapped the world in labels. Before you could say I or me. Before you understood who you were supposed to be. And yet you were not absent then. You were present. There was seeing without naming, hearing without interpreting, a feeling without judging, a simple awareness, open and unburdened, meeting the world moment by moment. Zen calls this the original face, not a face you can see in a mirror, and not a personality or a role, not something you build through effort. It is what was here before effort began. As we grow, layers gather naturally. They are not mistakes. Names help us function. Roles help us belong. Knowledge helps us navigate the world. Stories help us understand our lives. But over time, we can forget that these layers were added. We begin to believe we are the layers themselves. We say, "This is just who I am." We defend our identities. We cling to our histories. We feel defined by what we have achieved or failed to achieve. We measure ourselves against versions of ourselves that exist only in thought. And slowly, almost invisibly we lose touch with the quiet presence that was here before all of it. Tonight we will not try to remove the layers. We will not fight against identity or reject the world. Instead, we will gently look beneath what has been added. Through simple stories of record keepers and gardeners, monks and travelers, scholars and children, we will notice a pattern. Again and again, people discover that what they were searching for was never absent. They were simply looking in the wrong direction. This is not a teaching to believe, it is something to notice. Right now as you listen, there is awareness. You do not need to create it. You do not need to improve it. You do not need to understand it. It is simply here. The thoughts that come and go appear within it. The feelings that rise and fall move through it. Even the sense of I unfolds inside it, like the sky holding clouds without becoming any particular cloud. This awareness holds every experience without being reduced to any single one. We will explore this gently, slowly, without urgency. Let the pace of your breathing settle. Let the room around you fade slightly into the background. Let this moment be enough. The original face is not far away. It is not hidden behind years of effort. It is not locked behind understanding. It is closer than your next thought, closer than the sound of these words. And so we begin our first story. In a village nestled between two rivers, there lived a woman named Fen who believed that names were what made a person real. Fen had spent most of her life surrounded by ink and paper. Her small office stood beside the village hall, its wooden shelves lined with bound ledgers stretching back generations. Births were recorded there, marriages, land transfers, deaths. Every life that passed through the village left its mark inside her careful handwriting. When a child was born, the parents would come to her with quiet pride. Fen would dip her brush into ink, ask for the chosen name, and inscribe it with steady precision. The moment the name touched the page, it felt official, real, recognized. She often thought of herself as the keeper of existence. If it was written, it mattered. If it was not written, it could be forgotten. At least that was how she understood the world. Each morning she opened the shutters to let in soft light. Dust would rise gently in the beams as she reviewed the previous day's entries. She found comfort in order. Names in straight lines, dates aligned, family ties connected neatly from one page to the next. The village trusts her. People would say, "If Fen has written it, it must be so." And in time, Fen began to believe that names were the threads that held reality together. One afternoon, near the end of autumn, a stranger arrived. He was older, though not fragile. His clothes were worn from travel and his sandals carried the dust of distant roads. He entered the village hall quietly, as if he did not wish to disturb even the air. Fen looked up from her desk. "Yes," she asked, gently. The man bowed his head slightly. "I have come to stay," he said. She nodded, already reaching for a fresh page in the ledger reserved for new arrivals. "Your name." The man was silent. Fen waited, brush poised above the paper. After a moment, he replied, "I have no name." She blinked. "Everyone has a name," she said calmly. "If you wish to remain in the village, it must be recorded." The man's expression did not change. "Before I was given a name," he said, "was I not here?" Fen paused, uncertain how to respond. "That is not how we do things," she answered. "Without a name, how will we know who you are?" The stranger smiled softly. "You may call me whatever you like," he said. But what I am does not depend on it. Fen felt a faint irritation rise within her. This was not how records worked. This was not how society functioned. Names were anchors. Without them, everything drifted. She set her brush down. "If you refuse to give your name," she said carefully, "I cannot write you into the ledger." The man nodded as if she had confirmed something important. Then perhaps he replied, "I will remain unwritten." He bowed again and stepped outside. Fen sat still long after he left. Remain unwritten. The words unsettled her. For the first time in many years, she stared at the empty page before her and felt something unfamiliar, not confusion, exactly, but a subtle crack in certainty. That evening, she saw the stranger again by the river. The village's two rivers met at the edge of town, their waters folding into one another before continuing toward the sea. Fen often walked there at dusk to clear her mind. The man stood near the bank watching the current. She approached slowly. "You still have not given me your name," she said. He did not turn around. "Does the river have a name?" he asked. "Of course," Fen replied. "It is called the East Water." He nodded, and before it was called the East Water, Fen hesitated. It was still a river, she admitted. The man turned toward her then. Was it less a river before someone named it? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The current moved steadily behind him, silver under the fading light. Fen had always believed that recording a name gave shape to existence, but the river flowed whether or not anyone wrote it down. The stranger bent, scooped a handful of water, and let it slip through his fingers. "Words are useful," he said gently, "but they are not the source." The sound of water filled the space between them. Fen looked at the river, as if seeing it for the first time. She had written thousands of names in her lifetime, but she had never once written the river. And yet it remained. She returned home that night with a quiet restlessness she could not explain. For years she had believed that the ledger held the village together. Now a single unwritten name had begun to loosen something deep within her understanding. She lay awake longer than usual before she had been called Fen, before her parents had chosen those two simple syllables. What had she been? The question hovered softly in the dark, and for the first time she did not rush to answer it. The next morning, Fen woke before sunrise. The village was still wrapped in a pale blue quiet. Even the birds had not yet begun their songs. She sat at the edge of her bed and listened to the silence, noticing how complete it felt, without a single word spoken into it. For a moment, she did not think of her duties. She did not think of her name. There was only breathing. Inhale, exhale, simple, unwritten. When the sun finally touched the rooftops, she dressed and walked to her office as she always did. She opened the shutters. She arranged her brushes. She reviewed the ledger. But something had shifted. The names on the page no longer seemed as solid as they once had. They were still useful, still meaningful, but they felt lighter, as if they floated upon something deeper. Later that afternoon, she saw the stranger again by the river. This time she approached without accusation. "I have been thinking about what you said," she admitted. He nodded, inviting her to continue. "You asked whether the river was less a river before it was named." And what do you think he asked? Fen watched the water move past stones and fallen branches. "It was still flowing," she said slowly. "Still itself." The stranger smiled. "And before you were called Fen?" She felt the question land more deeply now. "I do not remember," she said. "Of course not," he replied gently. "Memory comes later. Words come later. Stories come later." He bent and picked up a small pebble, holding it between his fingers. "When you were born," he continued, "did you need to know your name in order to breathe?" She shook her head. "Did you need to understand language in order to see the sky again?" She shook her head. "There was awareness," he said, "simple and open, before anyone told you who you were, before you believed it." Fen felt something soften inside her. All her life she had believed that writing someone into the ledger confirmed their place in the world. But now she began to see something else. The ledger did not create existence. It described it. It pointed, like a finger pointing toward the moon. No matter how carefully she wrote the word river, the ink was not water. No matter how beautifully she formed a person's name, the brushstroke was not their living presence. She sat down on a smooth stone near the bank. "What happens," she asked quietly, "if someone forgets who they are?" The stranger considered her question. "They may forget their story," he said. "They may forget their roles. They may even forget their name." He let the pebble fall back into the water. But what they are does not disappear. Awareness does not depend on memory. The river carried the ripple outward, dissolving it into its current. Fen closed her eyes. Without reaching for her name, without recalling her history, she noticed something simple. There was the sound of water. There was the sensation of air against her skin. There was the steady rhythm of her breathing. All of it appeared within a quiet presence that did not need to be described. For a brief moment, she did not feel like the record keeper. She did not feel like the responsible daughter. She did not feel like the woman everyone depended on. She felt here, just here, and it was enough. When she opened her eyes, the world looked unchanged. The river still flowed. The trees still leaned toward the light. The stranger still stood before her. But her grip on certainty had loosened. That evening, she returned to her office and opened the ledger to the blank page she had prepared for him. She looked at the empty space. Instead of forcing a name onto it, she gently closed the book. For the first time, she allowed something to remain unwritten. Days passed. The stranger helped in small ways around the village. He carried water, repaired a fence, shared quiet meals with those who invited him. People began to refer to him casually, the traveler, the old man by the river. Yet he never claimed any title, and slowly Fen began to notice something. When she spoke with him, she felt less confined by her own role. She began walking by the river more often. She began sitting without purpose. She began noticing the space between thoughts. One afternoon, as sunlight shimmered across the water, she turned to him and said, "I think I understand now." He raised an eyebrow. "My name is useful," she continued, "but it is not what I am." The stranger bowed slightly. "And what are you?" Fen smiled, not because she had found an answer, but because she no longer needed one. The river flowed on. In time, the stranger left the village as quietly as he had arrived. Fen never recorded his name, but she no longer believed that existence depended on ink. Years later, when a child came to her desk for the first time, she still wrote the chosen name with care. But inside, she understood something she had not known before. Before the name there is life. Before the story there is presence. Before the roll there is awareness, and none of it can truly be written down. The river continued to flow through the village long after the stranger was gone. And sometimes at dusk, Fen would sit beside it, not as a keeper of records, but simply as the open awareness in which everything appeared. And perhaps in our own lives, we have also mistaken the ink for the river. We cling to titles, we polish our roles, we defend the stories written about us. Yet beneath them something quieter waits, not demanding recognition, not asking to be improved. Fen discovered that what is real does not depend on being recorded, but not everyone begins with such stillness. Some of us grow up beneath expectations so heavy that we mistake them for our own heartbeat. And so let us leave the riverbank for a while. Let us travel to a different village where a young man once believed that his worth was measured by the armor he wore and the name that followed him like a shadow. This is the story of Toro, the general's son. Toro was born into a house where strength was expected before tenderness. His father was the most respected general in the region, a man whose name carried weight long before he entered a room. Soldiers straightened when they heard it. Villagers lowered their voices. Even the wind seemed to move differently around him. From the day Toro could walk, he was told who he was. You are the general's son. The words followed him like a banner carried overhead. When he trained in the courtyard, instructors praised not only his form but his lineage. When he stumbled, they reminded him of the blood in his veins. When he succeeded, they spoke of destiny. He learned discipline early. He learned how to stand without fidgeting, how to bow without hesitation, how to hold a wooden sword with unwavering focus. His father watched from a distance, rarely smiling but always observing. Toro wanted to make him proud, and yet beneath that desire, something unsettled him. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the torches had burned low, he would sit alone in the garden behind the estate. The moonlight softened the edges of the world. Crickets filled the air with steady rhythm. There, without uniform or instruction, he felt different. He felt smaller, not in a diminished way, but in a quieter one, as if the weight of expectation slipped from his shoulders for a moment. He would look at his hands, the same hands that gripped a sword during the day, and wonder who they belonged to when no one was watching. Was he brave because others said he must be? Was he strong because it was required, or was there something else beneath the name he carried? As he grew older, the expectations grew heavier. Visitors came to dine with his father, speaking openly of Toro's future command. Maps were laid out across long tables, strategies discussed as if already entrusted to him. The path ahead seemed predetermined. "You will continue the family honor," his father said one evening, voice steady and certain. Toro nodded. He had learned to nod well, but that night in the quiet of his room, he lay awake staring at the ceiling beams. The name Toro meant tiger. It had been chosen for strength, but sometimes he did not feel like a tiger. Sometimes he felt like something unnamed. One afternoon, during a public ceremony, he stood beside his father in full training armor. The crowd gathered in admiration. Children pointed, older men bowed. The general's son, they whispered. He could feel their expectations pressing against him like invisible armor layered over metal. In that moment, he suddenly felt very far away from himself. The applause sounded distant. The cheers blurred. The sunlight reflecting off polished steel seemed too bright. He realized that every compliment he received was aimed at the image, not at whatever lived quietly inside him. That evening, he returned to the garden. But this time the stillness did not soothe him. It stirred something restless. He thought of the river beyond the hills, of distant villages he had never seen, of lives not shaped by military command. And for the first time, a dangerous thought formed clearly in his mind. What if the name he carried was not the same as what he was? The idea frightened him. Without his father's title, who would he be? Without the lineage, what would remain? Yet the question would not leave. Days passed, training continued, duties multiplied. But something had shifted. The armor that once felt honorable now felt tight. The praise that once filled him now rang hollow. Finally, one evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Toro approached his father. They stood facing one another in the courtyard where he had trained since childhood. Father Toro began, "Carefully, have you ever wondered who you were before you became a general?" His father studied him. "That question is meaningless," he replied. "I became who I was meant to become." Toro swallowed, and if I do not wish to become what is expected, silence fell between them. The air felt heavier than any armor. His father's voice, when it came, was firm. "You carry our name. That is not a choice." Toro bowed as he had been taught, but inside, something no longer bowed. That night, he packed only what he could carry lightly. Before dawn, while the estate still slept, he stepped beyond the gates and onto the road leading away from everything he had ever known. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he needed to discover whether the one who walked beneath the name was real. The road stretched ahead, quiet and uncertain. For the first time in his life, no one was watching. No one was calling him the general's son. There was only the sound of his footsteps and the vast sky opening above him. And somewhere beneath fear and doubt, there was a small, steady presence that did not seem defined by any title at all. Toro walked for days. The further he traveled, the lighter he felt and yet the more exposed. Without the estate walls, without the familiar rhythm of training bells, the world seemed vast and indifferent. Villages he passed through did not recognize him. No one bowed. No one whispered about lineage. At first, this anonymity unsettled him. If no one knew his name, did he still matter? One evening, as rain began to fall, he found shelter in a small roadside inn at the edge of a quiet town. The building was simple, with wooden beams darkened by years of smoke and weather. A single lantern burned near the entrance. Inside, a woman stood behind the counter, wiping cups with slow, deliberate care. She looked up as he entered. "You've come a long way," she said gently. He nodded, surprised that she could see it. "Will you be staying the night?" "Yes," he replied. She poured him tea without asking his name. The warmth spread through his hands as he held the cup. After a moment, she asked, "What brings you here?" He hesitated. In the past, he would have said, "I am the son of General," and the rest would have followed automatically. But here in this quiet inn, the words felt unnecessary. "I'm traveling," he said instead. She nodded, as if that were enough. Later that evening, as rain tapped softly against the roof, he found himself speaking more openly than he had intended. "I left home," he admitted. "Everyone there knows who I am supposed to be." "And who is that?" she asked. "The general's son." She smiled faintly. "And who are you?" The question landed with unexpected force. He searched for an answer, for a title, a role, a description, but none of them felt stable. "I don't know," he said at last. The woman set another log on the fire. "When you remove a robe," she said softly, "does the body disappear?" He frowned slightly. "No. The robe can be heavy," she continued, "decorated, honored, but it is still something worn." He stared into the flames. "All my life," he said quietly, "I have worn that robe, and now I'm afraid of what remains without it." The woman whose name he later learned was Sana poured more tea. "When you first arrived," she said, "you did not introduce yourself." I didn't know how, he admitted. And yet she replied, "You were here, sitting, breathing, listening." He looked at her. "You did not need a title for me to offer you tea," she continued. "You did not need a reputation in order to feel the warmth of the cup." He felt something loosen in his chest. The fire crackled gently. Outside, the rain softened. For many years, Sana said, people have come through this inn. Merchants, monks, soldiers, farmers. They introduce themselves with great certainty. She smiled. But when they fall asleep, their titles fall away. In sleep, no one is a general. No one is a servant. No one is praised or judged. She looked at him steadily. Yet, something remains. Toro sat very still. "What remains?" he asked. "Presence," she said simply. The word did not sound dramatic. It sounded ordinary, but as he listened to the rain fade into silence, he sensed what she meant. Even now, without armor, without recognition, there was still awareness. There was the sensation of sitting. There was the flicker of firelight. There was the quiet hum of existence itself. None of it depended on being the general sun. None of it required becoming anything more. For the first time since leaving home, Toro felt less like he was searching and more like he was noticing. The next morning when he stepped outside, the air felt different. The sky was wide, the road open. He was still called Toro. He still remembered his father. But the name felt lighter now, like a garment he could wear without mistaking it for his skin. Before he left, Sana said one final thing. "Do not try to become someone new," she told him. "Simply see what has always been here." He bowed deeply. As he continued down the road, he realized something quiet and steady was walking with him. Something that had been there long before. Expectations long before armor, long before titles. It did not need to be earned. It did not need to be proven. It simply was. And perhaps, like Toro, we too have worn robes so long that we forgot we could set them down. Let us continue our journey and meet someone who believed that knowledge itself defined her, until a child asked a question she could not answer. In a town known for its schools and scholars, there lived a woman named Hina. Hina was respected for her knowledge. Her house was filled with scrolls and stitched bound books, stacked carefully along the walls. Poems from distant provinces, philosophies from ancient masters, commentaries written in her own precise hand. Villagers often came to her with questions about history, about ethics, about the proper meaning of a passage long debated, and she almost always had an answer. From a young age, she had shown unusual curiosity. While other children played outside, she lingered near teachers, asking why the sky changed color at dusk, why people feared what they did not understand, why certain words carried more power than others. Her parents had encouraged her learning. Over time, her name became synonymous with wisdom. If you want clarity, people would say, ask Hina. She wore this reputation, like a finely tailored robe, not heavy like armor, but elegant, fitting closely to her sense of self. She believed she was her understanding. Each morning she would sit by the window where sunlight fell across her desk and copy passages in flowing script. The act of writing calmed her. Knowledge felt orderly, contained, structured. She appreciated that words could hold ideas steady. But one afternoon, something small unsettled her certainty. Her young granddaughter, barely 5 years old, came to visit. The child wandered through the room, touching the edges of books with quiet fascination. "Grandmother," she asked suddenly, "how do you know so much?" Hina smiled. "I studied for many years," she replied. "I listened carefully. I remembered what I was taught." The child nodded thoughtfully. Then she asked, "What did you know before you learned anything?" Hina paused. She assumed she had misheard. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. "Before you learned words," the child continued, "before anyone told you what things were called. What did you know?" The question lingered in the quiet room. Hina felt something unfamiliar, not ignorance, but a kind of open space where her usual answers did not immediately appear. Before language, before memory, before concepts, she had spent her life building knowledge, layer by layer. She could trace the origins of ideas across centuries. She could explain complex doctrines in simple terms. But she had never considered what existed prior to learning. The child satisfied with planting. The question skipped toward the doorway and disappeared into the courtyard. Hina remained seated. She looked around at the scrolls lining her walls. Each one contained insight gathered over generations. Each represented careful thought, preserved and refined. Yet none of them described what it was like to be a newborn before words formed, before meaning was attached. She closed her eyes. What had she known then? There had been sensation, light and shadow, warmth and coolness, sound and silence. There had been awareness, not named, not categorized, just present. She realized that before she had known definitions, she had known experience. Before she could describe the sky, she had seen it. Before she could analyze emotion, she had felt it. Before she could say something had simply been. This recognition unsettled her in a different way than confusion ever had. If knowledge came later, then what she truly was could not be limited to what she knew. The sun shifted across her desk, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily in the air. For the first time in many years, Hina allowed herself not to reach for a book. She simply sat, listening, breathing, aware. And she sensed faintly that whatever had been present before learning had never left. That evening, after her granddaughter had gone home, Hina did not light her usual lamp to continue copying texts. Instead, she remained by the window as twilight slowly dissolved the outlines of the courtyard. She noticed how naturally awareness remained even as light faded. She did not need a concept in order to see darkness gather. She did not need a definition to hear the wind move through the plum trees. Experience unfolded before thought could name it. For decades, she had believed that understanding came from arranging knowledge into clarity, but now she sensed something subtler. Knowledge described the world. Awareness met it directly. The next morning, when villagers came with questions, she listened as she always had. A farmer asked about the meaning of a proverb. A merchant sought guidance about fairness in trade. A student recited a passage incorrectly, and waited for correction. Hina answered each one carefully, but inwardly, something had changed. As she spoke, she noticed the quiet space in which words appeared. Before a sentence formed, there was a pause. Before a thought completed itself, there was simple knowing. She began to realize that even her most brilliant explanations arose from somewhere wordless. Later that afternoon, she walked alone beyond the town's edge where the fields opened into wide sky. She sat beneath a tree and closed her eyes. Without reaching for philosophy, without reciting teachings, she simply noticed what was present. The sensation of the ground beneath her, the rhythm of breath entering and leaving, the distant sound of wind bending tall grasses. All of it appeared effortlessly. She did not have to construct it. It was known before it was described. A memory surfaced, not of words, but of childhood. She remembered lying on her back as a little girl, staring up at clouds drifting across the sky. She had not known their names then. She had not known theories of weather or symbolism. Yet, she had known wonder. That wonder had not required explanation. It had been complete in itself. Tears gathered quietly at the corners of her eyes. She saw now that learning had added refinement, depth, perspective, but it had not created the fundamental capacity to know. That capacity had been present from the beginning, unlabeled, unclaimed, unowned. She whispered softly to herself before knowledge. There was awareness. And in that moment, her identity as a scholar felt lighter. Not diminished, just no longer absolute. She could continue to study. She could continue to teach, but she no longer mistook accumulated understanding for the ground of her being. When her granddaughter visited again, Hina knelt down and asked gently, "When you look at the sky, what do you see?" The child smiled. "Blue," she said, "and before you say blue." The girl paused, thinking hard. Then she laughed. I just see Hina laugh too. Yes, just seeing. Simple, immediate, whole. Years later, when people praised her wisdom, she accepted their words with kindness. But inside, she remembered something quieter than knowledge. Something that had been present before books, before language, before the name Hina. And perhaps like her, we had spent years collecting answers, only to discover that the most essential knowing was never learned at all. Let us now meet someone who believed that mastery defined him until he discovered that true creation comes not from adding, but from removing what was never essential. In a village nestled near the foothills, there lived a tea master named Vin. Vin's tea house was small, built of cedar wood that carried the faint scent of earth after rain. Travelers often said that stepping inside felt like entering a pause between breaths. Vin had practiced the art of tea for over 40 years. He knew precisely how long the water should rest after boiling. He knew how the leaves unfurled differently in winter than in spring. He could distinguish harvest regions by fragrance alone. People believed his mastery lay in precision, and for many years, Vin believed the same. He trained apprentices carefully. Temperature, he would say, is not just heat, it is timing. He corrected posture, adjusted hand position, insisted on silence during pouring. To him, the ceremony was sacred because it was exact. One afternoon, a woman arrived at the tea house, led gently by a young boy. Her eyes were pale and unfocused. She was blind. Vin welcomed her with a respectful bow and prepared tea as he always did. The water shimmered in the iron kettle. The cups were warmed and emptied. The leaves were measured without hesitation. He poured with flawless grace. The woman lifted the cup slowly and held it near her face. She inhaled, then she smiled. "This tea feels warm," she said softly. Vin nodded, though she could not see him. "Yes," he replied. "It was prepared carefully." She took a small sip. "It tastes gentle," she continued, "like something familiar." Vin felt a small flicker of pride, but then she asked a question he did not expect. "What color is it?" He hesitated. "It is a pale gold," he said. She laughed quietly. "I will never know that," she replied. "But I know it is warm. I know it is fragrant. I know it is here." Her words lingered in the quiet room. Vin suddenly realized that everything he had described about tea over the years, color, clarity, surface, reflection, meant nothing to her experience. And yet her experience was complete. She did not need to see the steam rising. She did not need to admire the hue of the liquid. She tasted it. She felt it. She knew it directly. After she left, Vin sat alone beside the empty cups. He had spent decades refining technique, believing mastery meant perfect form. But now he wondered, what existed before technique, before instruction, before refinement? When he first tasted tea as a boy, long before he knew proper temperature or pouring angle, what had he known? He closed his eyes and lifted a cup to his lips. There was warmth. There was bitterness, softening into sweetness. There was simple presence. No theory, no comparison, just tasting. For the first time in many years, Vin sensed that the essence of tea had never depended on ceremony. Ceremony pointed toward it. But the essence had always been immediate. And perhaps he thought quietly the same was true of the one who tasted. That evening, Vin did not close the tea house immediately. He prepared another pot this time, without the careful sequence he had enforced for so many years. He did not measure the leaves with ritual precision. He did not warm the cups in exact order. He did not adjust the angle of his wrist to perfection. He simply poured. The steam rose as it always had. The scent unfolded as it always had. He lifted the cup. For a brief moment, habit tried to return, to evaluate, to judge, to compare. But he let those impulses pass. Instead, he noticed what the blind woman had noticed: warmth against his palms, the subtle shift of flavor across the tongue, the way bitterness opened into sweetness without effort. No description was necessary. The experience was complete before thought arrived. He realized then that ceremony had never created tea. It had shaped attention. It had refined movement. But the essence, the living encounter between warmth and awareness, had always been immediate. For years, apprentices had asked him, "Master, what makes tea perfect?" He had answered with instructions. Now he began to see a different answer forming quietly within him. Perfection was not in the angle of the pour. It was not in the silence of the room. It was not in the admiration of guests. It was in simple presence. The next day, when students gathered, he surprised them. Instead of beginning with posture, he asked, "When you drink tea, what do you notice before you think about it?" They looked at one another, unsure. One at a time, he encouraged. A young apprentice spoke first. "It is warm," he said. Another added, "It smells earthy." A third hesitated, then said, "It feels calming." Vin nodded. "Before you analyze," he said gently, "before you compare, before you try to make it better, there is simple knowing." He paused. That knowing does not need improvement. Some of the apprentices looked confused. They had come to master technique. But Vin understood now that technique without awareness was hollow, and awareness without technique was already complete. In the weeks that followed, he still practiced carefully. He still honored tradition. But something inside him had softened. He no longer believed that mastery defined him. He was not the perfection of his movements. He was not the reputation of his tea house. He was not even the years of refinement he had accumulated. All of those were robes, beautiful, meaningful but worn. Beneath them there was something simpler, the same presence that had tasted tea as a child, the same awareness that had existed before his first lesson. And, perhaps like Vin, we have mistaken refinement for essence. We polish our skills, we perfect our performance, we believe we are what we do well. Yet before the performance, there is presence. Before mastery, there is simple being. Let us now meet someone who believed that creation required adding more until he discovered that truth sometimes appears only when what is unnecessary is gently removed. In a quiet mountain village where the air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, there lived a wood carver named Bim. Bim was known for his statues. From large cedar trunks, he carved figures so lifelike that villagers often stood in silence before them. The curve of a cheek, the fold of a robe, the softness in a carved gaze, everything seemed to breathe. When asked how he achieved such realism, he would simply smile. "The figure is already inside," he would say. "I only remove what is not needed." Apprentices admired him deeply. They watched his steady hands, the rhythm of his tools striking wood with patient certainty. They believed his skill came from talent, from years of refining control and precision. And Bim allowed them to believe it. Yet the truth of his craft was quieter. As a young boy, Bim had once found a broken branch washed down from the hills after a storm. While other children ignored it, he picked it up and stared at its twisted shape. He did not think about technique. He did not think about outcome. He simply looked. In the curve of the branch, he saw something not clearly formed, but hinted. He spent hours scraping away splinters with a small knife until a simple bird shape emerged. It was not perfect, but when he held it up, he felt a strange recognition. It was as if the bird had always been there. Years later, when his reputation grew, people praised his artistry. They assumed he imagined figures from nothing and imposed them upon raw wood. But Bim knew better. He never felt that he created anything. He felt that he uncovered. One winter, a wealthy merchant traveled from a distant town and commissioned a statue of great importance, a guardian figure, to stand at the entrance of his estate. The merchant brought with him a massive log of ancient cedar, thick and dense. "I want it to be magnificent," he insisted. "Strong, imposing, worthy of admiration." Bim nodded and accepted the commission. For days he circled the log without touching it. Apprentices grew restless. Master One asked, "Why do you not begin?" Bim rested his palm against the wood. "It is not ready," he said softly. They did not understand. To them, carving meant adding detail. To Bim, it meant listening. Finally, after many silent hours, he lifted his tools and began. The first cuts were bold. Chunks of wood fell to the floor. The apprentices watched as shape slowly emerged, the outline of shoulders, the suggestion of a face. But something was different this time. As the days passed, Bim felt tension growing within him. The merchant's words echoed in his mind. Magnificent, imposing, worthy of admiration. He realized he was trying to satisfy expectation. He was adding emphasis, exaggerating features, deepening lines. The figure began to look powerful, but heavy. It did not feel alive. One evening after the apprentices had left, Bim remained alone in the workshop. Snow pressed softly against the windows. He stared at the statue. It was impressive, but it was not true. He closed his eyes. When he first learned to carve, before he had clients, before praise or payment, what had guided his hands, there had been quiet attention. There had been seeing without pressure. He touched the surface of the statue. Beneath the exaggerated form, he sensed something gentler, a simpler presence waiting to be revealed. For the first time since accepting the commission, he understood. He had not been removing what was unnecessary. He had been adding what did not belong. He picked up his chisel again. This time he did not try to make the figure magnificent. He removed. He softened the jaw. He eased the tension in the shoulders. He carved away sharp lines that had been shaped by expectation rather than vision. Slowly, something shifted. The guardian no longer looked imposing. It looked steady, not dramatic, but present. And as Bim stepped back, he felt the familiar recognition return. The figure had been there all along. He had simply needed to stop adding himself to it. The next morning, the apprentices returned and gathered around the statue, in silence. Something had changed. The guardian figure no longer strained to appear powerful. Its posture was relaxed yet unmistakably grounded. The eyes, once sharply carved to intimidate, now held a quiet steadiness. The lines of the robe flowed naturally, no longer exaggerated for effect. One apprentice frowned. "Master," he said, "it seems simpler." Bim nodded. "Yes, but the merchant asked for something magnificent." Bim rested his hand lightly against the wood. "Magnificent," he said slowly, "does not mean heavy." He looked at them carefully. When you first begin carving, you think skill is about adding detail. You want to show what you can do, so you carve deeper lines, sharper edges, stronger gestures. The apprentices listened closely. But Mastery, Bim continued, is learning what to remove. He walked to a pile of discarded wood shavings gathered from the previous days. "These pieces," he said, lifting a curled shaving between his fingers, were never the figure. He let it fall. They only covered it. The apprentices exchanged glances. Bim continued, his voice softer now. "When I was young, I believed I created statues. I believed the figure came from my imagination. But the more I carved, the more I understood something else." He returned to the statue and touched the center of its chest. "The form is already here, hidden, waiting. My work is not to force it into being." He paused. "It is to clear away what is not essential." One apprentice asked quietly, "How did you know what is not essential?" Bim smiled. "When I am still enough," he said, "I can feel it." That evening, after the apprentices had gone, Bim sat alone in the workshop once more. The statue stood finished beside him. The merchant arrived days later to collect it. He walked slowly around the figure, inspecting it from every angle. "It is not as fierce as I imagined," he remarked. Bim bowed respectfully. "It will not frighten visitors," the merchant continued. "No," Bim agreed, "but it will not tremble either." The merchant studied the statue again. There was something undeniably steady about it. It did not demand attention. It did not exaggerate its strength. It simply stood. After a long pause, the merchant nodded. "It feels real," he admitted. When the statue was carried away, Bim remained in the doorway of his workshop and watched until it disappeared down the snowy path. He reflected on his own life. As a boy, he had been called talented. As a young man, he had been praised as gifted. As an adult, he had been named master. Each title had shaped him in subtle ways. At times, he had tried to live up to them, carving with more intensity, striving to prove the reputation true. But beneath those names, there had always been something quieter. The simple act of seeing, the patient listening to wood grain beneath his palm, the steady awareness present before any tool touched the surface. That presence had never needed a title. It had been there before praise, before commissions, before the name Bim was spoken over him. He understood now that carving wood and uncovering one's true nature were not so different. In both, nothing new was added. What is unnecessary is gently removed. Expectation, comparison, fear, until what remains stands naturally without strain. And, perhaps, like Bim, we spend years trying to become more sharper, stronger, more impressive, believing that growth means accumulation. Yet sometimes, clarity comes not from adding layers, but from letting them fall away. Let us now turn to someone who believed her identity was rooted in what she created, until a single storm revealed what could not be washed away. In a valley where the seasons arrived with dramatic beauty, there lived a gardener named Kara. Kara was known for transforming barren land into color. When she first arrived in the valley years earlier, the soil had been dry and uneven. Stones pressed stubbornly through the earth. Weeds tangled across forgotten paths. But Kara saw possibility. She began slowly turning soil by hand, removing rocks one by one, studying how light moved across the field throughout the day. She planted not for immediate bloom, but for rhythm. Spring blossoms followed summer greens. Summer greens softened into autumn gold. Winter stripped everything back to stillness. Over time, the valley changed. Visitors traveled from neighboring towns just to walk through her gardens. They spoke of harmony, of balance, of beauty carefully arranged. And as praise grew, so did Kara's quiet attachment to what she had built. People no longer said, "Look at the valley," they said. "Look at Kara's garden." The land became her identity. She rose before dawn to tend it. She memorized which flowers opened first each morning. She knew which branches needed trimming before they showed signs of strain. When a blossom failed to bloom, she felt it personally. When visitors complimented her design, she felt affirmed. The garden was not simply her work, it was her reflection. One summer clouds gathered heavier than usual. The rains began, gently at first soaking the soil with welcome relief. Kara walked the paths with satisfaction, believing the storm would nourish what she had cultivated. But the rain did not stop. For days it fell. The river at the edge of the valley swelled beyond its banks. Water pressed into the lower beds of the garden, lifting roots from earth-bending stems flat against the mud. Kara stood helpless beneath a gray sky as currents carved new channels through carefully designed rows. By the time the storm passed, the valley looked unfamiliar. Paths had vanished. Flower beds lay submerged in silt. Trees leaned at angles she had never intended. She walked through the wreckage slowly. Each step felt like loss. Years of tending altered overnight. Visitors did not come anymore. There was nothing orderly to admire. In the silence that followed the storm, Kara felt something more unsettling than grief. If the garden was no longer as it had been, who was she? She had introduced herself for years as its caretaker, its designer, its guardian. Without it in its former beauty, her sense of self felt shaken. For several days, she avoided the valley entirely. She remained inside her small cottage, listening to the river settle back into its banks. Finally, unable to resist, she stepped outside again. The destruction was still visible, but something else was visible too. Small green shoots had begun to push through the mud. Unplanned, unarranged, alive, Kara knelt beside one fragile stem. She had not planted it. She had not positioned it according to design. Yet, it grew. The earth, even disturbed, still carried life. The river, though destructive, had not erased the valley. It had changed its form. As she sat there, mud on her hands, she felt a quiet question arise. Had she mistaken the garden's arrangement for its source, she had shaped its appearance. But she had not created growth. Growth came from something deeper, from soil, from water, from light. Long before she arrived. Long before the name Kara was spoken in that valley. She remained there until sunset, watching the softened landscape without trying to fix it. For the first time since the storm, she did not see ruin. She saw life continuing, and something within her began to loosen. In the days that followed, Kara did not rush to restore the garden to its former design. Instead, she walked slowly through the valley each morning, observing without judgment. Where once there had been straight rows, there were now curves shaped by water. Where delicate blossoms had stood, wild grasses began to rise. Where stones had bordered careful paths, new channels shimmered in sunlight. At first, she felt the impulse to correct everything, to rebuild symmetry, to replant exactly as before. But something held her back. She remembered how fiercely she had once guarded every arrangement, how closely her sense of worth had been tied to the garden's appearance. If the flowers thrived, she felt successful. If they withered, she felt diminished. Now, kneeling beside a cluster of new growth, she saw clearly. The life of the valley had never belonged to her. She had guided it. She had shaped it. But she had not been its source. The soil did not ask for her name. The river did not depend on her design. The sun rose whether or not she planned for it. She placed her hand flat against the earth. Beneath her palm, she felt warmth, moisture, movement too subtle to see. Life continued without consulting her identity, and in that realization, a quiet relief spread through her chest. If she was not the creator of growth, then she was not responsible for controlling it. She began tending the valley differently, not as a sculptor imposing form, but as a listener responding to what was already unfolding. She planted where the soil felt ready. She left untouched where wildflowers insisted on rising. She allowed the river's new curve to remain. Visitors eventually returned. They remarked that the garden felt different, less arranged, less dramatic, but more alive. Kara smiled when they said this, because she too felt different. She no longer introduced herself as the one who made the valley beautiful. She simply said, "I care for the land." And even that felt lighter than before. One evening, as twilight settled gently across the fields, she sat beside the river and watched the water move. Before she had ever planted a seed, the valley had existed. Before she had shaped a single path, the earth had held life. And long after her hands grew still, the valley would continue. She saw now that her identity had been like a carefully designed flower bed. meaningful, intricate, but temporary. Beneath it was something deeper, the same presence that had watched the storm, the same awareness that had felt grief, the same quiet knowing that now watched new shoots rise. That presence had not been washed away. It had not been damaged by loss. It simply remained. And perhaps, like Kara, we believe we are defined by what we build our work, our relationships, our achievements. Yet when circumstances shift, when storms reshape our carefully arranged lives, something continues. Not the design, but the awareness in which the design appears. Let us now meet someone who believed his value lay in a skill he feared he was losing, until he discovered that what he truly was could not fade with ability. In a coastal town where the sound of waves was constant and steady, there lived a bell maker named Bo. For most of his life, Bo had shaped bronze into voices, large temple bells, small household chimes, ceremonial gongs that echoed across valleys. People said his bells carried unusual depth, a tone that lingered long after the strike. Bo believed this depth came from listening. Before casting each bell, he would sit quietly with the metal. He would close his eyes and imagine the sound it wished to become. He would adjust thickness, curvature, and alloy mixture with patient precision. When the bell was finally struck for the first time, he felt a thrill, each time not of pride, but of recognition. The sound seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond him. Years passed. His reputation grew. Temples from distant towns requested his work. Apprentices gathered to learn the craft. Bo's name became inseparable from resonance, but slowly something began to change. It started subtly. At first he noticed that certain high tones felt faint. The ringing seemed thinner at the edges. He assumed fatigue. He assumed distraction. But the change did not reverse. Months later, during the unveiling of a large temple bell he had spent nearly a year creating, the crowd gathered in anticipation. A monk stepped forward and struck the bell with a padded beam. The sound rolled outward, rich, full, magnificent. The crowd gasped softly in admiration. Bo stood among them. He saw their expressions. He felt the vibration faintly in his chest. But he could not hear the full tone. Where once there had been layered resonance, now there was only a distant hum. A quiet dread began to settle in him. In the following weeks, he tested his hearing privately. Small chimes sounded dull. High frequencies slipped past him unnoticed. The doctor in town confirmed what he feared. "Your hearing is fading," he said gently. "It may continue to weaken." Bo walked home slowly that evening. The ocean roared beside the cliffs, but its edges seemed softened. If he could not hear clearly, who was he? He had defined himself through sound. He had measured his worth in vibration and tone. Without the ability to hear fully, would his craft and his identity dissolve? For several days he avoided the workshop. The tools lay untouched. The molds cooled in silence. He felt as though the world had withdrawn slightly from him. But one morning, drawn by habit or perhaps longing, he returned. He placed his hand against the side of an unfinished bell. He struck it lightly. The sound rose, muted to his ears, yet beneath his palm, he felt something else. A tremor, a vibration that moved through metal into skin. It was not heard, it was known. Bo stood still, hand resting on bronze, and allowed the subtle movement to travel through him. The bell was speaking not only in sound, but in sensation. He realized then that for years he had focused on hearing with his ears. But the resonance had always been more than sound. It had been presence moving through space. And that presence could still be felt. Bo kept his hand against the bell, long after the vibration faded. He struck it again, this time more firmly. Though the audible tone was faint to him, the movement through the metal was undeniable. It traveled into his palm, up his arm, into his chest. The bell was not only something to be heard, it was something to be felt. For years he had taught apprentices to listen carefully, to close their eyes and refine their ears. Now he began teaching them differently. "Place your hand here," he instructed one afternoon, guiding a student's palm against a newly cast bell. The apprentice looked puzzled. "Strike it," Bo said. The young man obeyed. His eyes widened as the vibration pulsed through his skin. "It's alive," he whispered. Bo smiled. Yes, alive. He began to notice other things as well. When waves crashed against the shore, even if he could not hear their full roar, he could feel the subtle trembling in the ground beneath his feet. When wind moved through temple rafters, he sensed its shifted pressure against his face. The world had not grown silent. It had simply changed the way it revealed itself. One evening he sat beside the ocean cliffs where he had often gone in his youth. In earlier years, he would close his eyes and immerse himself in the layered sounds, gulls, crying waves, colliding distant bells from harbor boats. Now much of that richness had faded from his ears. Yet as he sat there, he noticed something surprising. Awareness itself had not diminished. There was still seeing, there was still feeling, there was still simple presence. The loss belonged to a faculty, not to what he was. He realized that he had confused ability with identity. He had believed he was the one who could hear perfectly. He had believed his worth depended on precision of perception. But before he ever cast his first bell, before he had refined his hearing, before anyone called him master, there had been awareness. That awareness had not grown older. It had not weakened. It simply remained. Months later, when a temple requested a large ceremonial bell, Bo accepted the commission without hesitation. Apprentices worried quietly. Master One said gently, "How will you tune it if you cannot hear clearly?" Bo placed his hand on the apprentice's shoulder. "I do not tune with ears alone," he replied. He shaped the bronze with careful attention as always. When the casting was complete, he rested both palms against the bell and asked a student to strike it. The vibration surged through him, full, steady, deep. He adjusted the thickness in small increments over several days, guided not by audible sharpness but by felt resonance. When the bell was finally installed and struck before the gathered monks, the sound rolled outward, strong and clear. The crowd bowed in admiration. Bo felt the vibration in his bones and smiled. He no longer feared silence, because he understood now that what he truly was had never been dependent on sound. And perhaps, like Bo, we fear losing what we believe defines us: a talent, a role, a strength. Yet when something fades, something deeper remains. Not the skill, not the reputation, but the simple awareness in which all abilities arise and dissolve. Let us now meet someone who believed connection was woven through action, until she discovered the quiet ground beneath every relationship. In a riverside village where fishing nets hung like woven curtains between wooden posts, there lived a woman named Kai. Kai was known for her weaving. Her nets were strong, yet flexible, tight enough to hold the smallest catch, wide enough to move gracefully through water. Fishermen trusted her work without question. From dawn until late afternoon, she sat beneath a shaded awning, fingers moving in steady rhythm. Thread crossed thread, knots formed with effortless precision. To watch her work was to witness patience made visible. Children often asked how she learned to weave so well. She would smile and say, "By repeating the same movement 1,000 times." But repetition alone was not the secret. There was a tension in her hands. She did not weave while distracted. She did not rush to finish. Each crossing of fiber carried quiet awareness. Over the years, people began to say that Kai could weave even in darkness. The comment began as praise. Eventually, it became reputation. She took pride in this identity, the dependable weaver, the one whose work never failed. One season, however, the river changed. The currents grew unpredictable. Fish moved differently. Nets that had worked for years began to tear under unfamiliar strain. Fishermen returned frustrated. "Your knots are not holding," one complained. Kai inspected the damaged net carefully. The weaving was sound, but the water was stronger than before. She adapted the pattern. She tightened certain crossings. She reinforced edges. Yet still some nets returned torn. For the first time in her life, she felt doubt. If her weaving could not guarantee results, what was she without success? She worked longer hours, hands stiff in the evening. She analyzed patterns late into the night. Her identity felt tied to performance. If the nets failed, she felt diminished. One afternoon, exhausted, she set aside her tools and walked to the riverbank. She watched the current move. It did not weave, it did not knot, yet it flowed. The surface shimmered in sunlight, shifting without effort. Kai noticed something subtle. Before her hands began moving each morning, before the first knot was tied, there was a simple stillness. A presence that did not depend on outcome. She had mistaken the movement of weaving for the source of steadiness. But steadiness had been there before action began. She dipped her fingers into the water. The river did not resist. It moved around her hand and continued on. In that moment, she sensed that her value had never been in the tightness of her knots. It had been in the awareness that guided her fingers. And that awareness did not tear when a net did. The next morning, Kai returned to her weaving bench before sunrise. The village was quiet. Nets swayed gently in the early breeze. For a long moment, she did not begin working. She simply sat. She noticed the sensation of the wooden stool beneath her, the faint smell of damp rope, the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Before any thread crossed another, there was presence, uncomplicated. She picked up the fibers slowly. This time she did not weave with tension. She did not imagine the fisherman's complaints. She did not measure her worth against the river's force. She allowed her hands to move in the same quiet awareness she had touched at the riverbank. Thread over thread, knot after knot, the pattern changed slightly, not from fear but from listening. She began to understand that weaving was not about controlling the river. It was about responding to it, and response required attention, not identity. When fishermen returned later that week, some nets still bore strain. But Kai did not feel shaken. The river was alive. It shifted, it strengthened, it softened. Her weaving adapted, but what she truly was, did not depend on whether a net held or tore. One young apprentice approached her hesitantly. "Master Kai," he asked, "how do you know when a net is strong enough?" She guided his hands to the woven fibers. "Feel it," she said. He pressed gently. "It feels firm," he replied. She shook her head softly. "Before you judge firmness," she said, "feel the space between the threads." He looked confused. "There is space," she continued, "and there is connection. Both are necessary." She paused. "The thread is not strong by itself. The knot is not strong by itself. Strength comes from relationship." As she spoke, she realized the deeper truth beneath her own words. Her identity had been like a single thread defined by usefulness, by function. But awareness was like the space in which all threads met. It did not strain, it did not tear. It allowed connection to appear. That evening, as she watched the sunset reflect across the water, she no longer felt defined by success or failure. The river flowed. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. There was simple being, and from that being weaving would continue, not as proof of worth, but as expression of presence. And perhaps like Kai, we believe, connection depends on what we do, how well we perform, how tightly we hold things together. Yet beneath action, beneath outcome, there is a deeper field in which all relationships arise, a quiet awareness that does not fray. Let us now meet someone who tried to preserve her life in written pages until she discovered that what she truly was could never be contained by memory. In a quiet house at the edge of a bustling city, there lived a woman named Yuki. Yuki had kept a journal every single day for more than 60 years. The shelves of her study were lined from floor to ceiling with identical notebooks, each spine labeled carefully in black ink, 1964, 1965, 1966. And so, on year after year, like stepping stones across a lifetime, she began writing as a young girl, after her mother placed a small cloth-bound notebook in her hands and said, "If you write it down, you will never lose yourself." Yuki believed her. Every evening before sleep, no matter how tired she felt, she sat at her desk and recorded the day. What she had eaten, who she had met, what she had felt, what she feared, what she hoped. At first, the entries were simple, but as she grew older, they became deeper, more reflective, more careful. She did not merely describe events. She described who she believed she was within them. "I am becoming stronger. I am disappointed in myself. I am in love. I am lost." The words "I am" appeared thousands of times across those pages. The journals became anchors. When life felt uncertain, she turned to earlier volumes to remind herself of continuity. She traced the handwriting of her younger self and felt reassured. "See," she would think, "I have always been here." When painful years arrived, the illness of her father, the end of a marriage, long stretches of loneliness, she wrote with greater urgency. If she could preserve the experience in ink, it would not dissolve into chaos. Writing gave shape to memory, and memory, she believed, preserved identity. On her 70th birthday, her niece visited and asked shyly, "May I read something you wrote when you were my age?" Yuki hesitated. Then she pulled down a volume from decades earlier and handed it over. Her niece flipped through the pages, smiling at certain passages. "You were very intense," she laughed gently. "You felt everything so strongly." Yuki smiled in return. "Yes," she said, "I did." That night, curiosity stirred within her. After everyone had gone home, she took down several old journals and began reading them in order. At first, she felt nostalgia. But soon something stranger emerged. The young woman described in those pages, full of certainty, conviction, dramatic sorrow, ambitious dreams, felt distant. She remembered writing the words. She remembered living those moments. Yet the emotional charge had faded. Some beliefs she once defended fiercely now seemed unnecessary. Some fears that once kept her awake felt almost tender, like memories of a child afraid of shadows. She turned page after page. Version after version of herself appeared. The hopeful student, the devoted daughter, the heartbroken lover, the determined professional, the weary caregiver. Each one had written with confidence, "This is who I am." Yet each had dissolved into the next. Yuki closed one journal slowly and stared at the shelves. If she had been so many different I am statements over the years, which one was true? Was she the woman who had written those entries? Or the one reading them now? A few days later, a small accident unsettled her further. While reaching for a volume from the highest shelf, she lost her balance. Several journals tumbled down, hitting the floor with a dull thud. One split open, loose pages scattered across the room. For a brief moment, panic rose in her chest. It felt as though her life itself had been torn apart. She knelt quickly, gathering pages with trembling hands. But as she looked at them spread across the floor, something unexpected occurred. The ink on older pages had faded slightly. Some entries were smudged. Yet the awareness reading them, the quiet presence, noticing the fading ink, felt steady. The memories had changed. The handwriting had aged. The emotions described had risen and fallen like seasons. But the simple knowing here now, the one aware of all these pages, had not aged in the same way. She sat back on her heels, journals surrounding her like fallen leaves. Before she had written her first entry, before her mother's advice about remembering, there had been presence. When she was a child staring at rain against the window, there had been awareness. When she was a young woman in love, there had been awareness. When she grieved beside a hospital bed, there had been awareness. The journals recorded the waves, but something deeper had remained, like the ocean beneath them. For the first time in decades, Yuki closed her notebook at night without writing. She sat in silence instead. No preservation, no description. Just the quiet presence in which every memory had appeared. And she began to sense that what she truly was had never been contained in ink. The following evening, Yuki returned to her study with a different intention. Instead of reaching immediately for her pen, she stood quietly before the shelves. Row after row of journals reflected back decades of effort. Careful handwriting preserved thoughts, recorded identities. She pulled down a volume from the middle of the collection and opened it at random. "I am afraid of becoming invisible," one entry read. She paused. At the time she wrote those words, the fear had felt urgent and real. It had shaped her actions, influenced her decisions, colored her relationships. Yet now, reading it years later, she noticed something gentle. The fear had passed. The one who felt invisible had changed. But the awareness reading the sentence now felt the same simple clarity it had felt in countless other moments. She opened another journal. "I am finally certain of who I am," she had written boldly at age 32. Yuki smiled softly. Certainty had come and gone many times since then. She turned to a different year. I no longer recognize myself. Another entry, confessed during a season of loss. And yet the very act of writing those words had required a quiet witness, something that recognized confusion without being destroyed by it. Slowly she began to see the pattern. Every journal entry described a state: confident, fearful, in love, alone, hopeful, resigned. States shifted like weather. The pages documented the sky. But something had always remained like open space behind it. She closed her eyes and set the journal aside. Right now, without reaching into memory, without reference in any past version of herself, what was present? There was breathing. There was the faint hum of evening traffic beyond the window. There was the sensation of her hands resting lightly in her lap. And there was awareness of all of it. She did not need to recall her childhood to exist. She did not need to remember her achievements to feel present. She did not need to revisit grief to know she had survived it. Awareness did not depend on the story. The story moved within it. For years she had believed that writing preserved her identity. Now she saw something different. Writing preserved experience, but what she truly was had never required preservation. It had never been lost, even when she forgot details, even when pages tore, even when ink faded. That simple knowing remained. The next morning, she placed a small bookmark into her current journal and closed it gently. She did not stop writing entirely, but she no longer wrote to hold herself together. She wrote as expression, not as proof. Later that week, her niece returned. "Are you writing tonight?" the girl asked curiously. Yuki shook her head. "Not tonight," she said. "What if you forget something important?" Yuki looked at her carefully. "If it is important," she replied softly, "it will appear again." And if it did not, she sensed awareness itself would still remain. As dusk settled across the city, she sat once more in quiet stillness. The shelves stood behind her, full of years. But for the first time, she did not feel defined by them. The journals were like waves upon the surface of a vast ocean. Beautiful, temporary, and beneath them, steady, silent, immeasurable, the ocean itself. And perhaps, like Yuki, we cling to memory in order to secure identity. We believe our continuity depends on story. Yet before the first memory arose, there was awareness, and that awareness has never needed a page to exist. Let us now meet someone who believed that age was slowly taking her away, until she discovered that what she truly was did not grow old. In a quiet temple garden, where cedar trees stood older than memory, there lived an elderly caretaker named Oso. Oso had tended the temple grounds for more than 40 years. Each morning before sunrise, he swept fallen leaves from the stone paths. He trimmed moss along the edges of lanterns. He pruned branches carefully so that light could filter through in balanced measure. Visitors often remarked on the serenity of the garden. "It feels timeless," they would say. Oso would bow gently, but time, he knew, was not absent. He felt it in his knees when he knelt. He felt it in the stiffness of his fingers on cold mornings. He felt it in the slowing rhythm of his steps. The trees he had planted as saplings now towered high above him. The young monks who once carried buckets beside him had grown into teachers themselves, and when he caught his reflection in the still pond near the temple gate, he sometimes paused. The face looking back at him was lined. Hair, once dark, had turned the color of winter ash. One afternoon, a young visitor approached him. grandfather?" the boy asked innocently. "Were you always old?" Oso laughed. "No," he replied. "I was once younger than you." The boy stared at him puzzled, as if trying to imagine such a thing. That evening, after the temple bell had rung and the grounds had emptied, Oso sat beside the largest cedar tree in the garden. He remembered planting it decades ago. He had been strong then, quick, confident. He remembered believing that time stretched endlessly ahead. Now, sitting beneath its wide branches, he felt something different. Time no longer felt endless. It felt precious, and sometimes quietly it felt threatening. If his body continued to age, if strength faded further, who would he be? For so long he had defined himself through service, through movement, through physical care of the land. What would remain if he could no longer sweep the paths? He placed his palm against the trunk of the cedar. Its bark was rough and cool. He closed his eyes. He remembered being young and touching this same tree when it was no taller than his shoulder. He remembered middle age trimming its lower branches. He remembered storms that had bent it nearly sideways. Through all those years, the tree had changed in form, and so had he. But as he sat there in stillness, he noticed something subtle. The awareness that had known himself as young was the same awareness now knowing himself as old. The body had shifted, strength had waxed and waned, roles had evolved, but the simple sense of being the quiet presence that noticed change felt untouched by age. He opened his eyes slowly. Leaves drifted gently to the ground. Time moved through the garden. Yet something in him did not feel diminished. He had mistaken aging for disappearance. But perhaps what he truly was had never belonged to youth or age at all. In the weeks that followed, Oso began to move through the garden with quieter attention. He no longer hurried to complete every task before the younger monks arrived. Instead, he allowed them to carry heavier buckets. He allowed them to climb ladders he once scaled effortlessly. At first, this surrender felt uncomfortable. He had long associated usefulness with worth. If he could no longer work as before, was he becoming unnecessary? One morning, as he slowly swept fallen leaves, a young monk approached him. "Master Oso," the monk said, "you have cared for this garden longer than anyone. How do you keep it so peaceful?" Oso paused. He looked around at the stone paths, the lanterns dusted with moss, the pond reflecting drifting clouds. "For many years," he replied, "I believed peace came from maintaining order." He leaned lightly on his broom. "But the garden changes whether I wish it to or not. Leaves fall, branches break, moss spreads." He smiled gently. "Peace is not in stopping change. It is in seeing that what notices change does not itself wither." The monk listened carefully, though perhaps he did not yet fully understand. Later that day, Oso walked again to the large cedar tree. He sat at its base and closed his eyes. Memories rose naturally. He saw himself as a young man carrying stones to build the first path. He saw himself in middle age correcting a novice's planting technique. He saw himself last winter pausing to rest after only a few minutes of sweeping. Each image carried a different body, a different posture, a different strength. Yet the simple awareness in which those memories appeared felt unchanged. It did not feel young. It did not feel old. It simply was. He placed his hand over his chest. The heartbeat beneath his palm was slower than in youth, but awareness of that heartbeat was clear. Age belonged to the body. Time belonged to seasons, but the presence that knew both seemed untouched. As autumn deepened, Visitors continued to remark on the tranquility of the garden. They did not see the small tremor in Oso's hands. They did not notice the extra moments he took before rising. But Oso noticed something else. The fear of aging had softened. He no longer felt as though time was taking him away. Time was changing form, but what he truly was did not appear or disappear with those forms. One evening, as the temple bell echoed across the grounds, he stood very still. The sound moved through the air. Leaves rustled in response. Shadows lengthened. Everything shifted, and within all that movement, there was quiet awareness, steady as the open sky above the cedar branches. He bowed gently toward the garden, not as its owner, not as its protector, but as the simple presence in which youth and age, strength and weakness had all appeared. And perhaps, like Oso, we fear that time is carrying us away. We see lines deepen in the mirror. We feel energy rise and fall. Yet, beneath the changing body, beneath the passing years, there is something that does not measure itself in seasons. Let us now meet someone who believed loss had defined her forever, until she discovered that even grief moves within something untouched. In a small riverside village where mist lingered over the water each morning, there lived a woman named Mina. Mina ferried people across the river for most of her life. Her boat was simple wood worn smooth by years of hands and weather. Each day before dawn, she untied the rope from the dock and pushed gently into the current, carrying farmers, merchants, children on their way to school. She knew the river intimately, where it ran, shallow, where stones hid beneath the surface, where currents shifted after heavy rain. For decades, the rhythm of rowing shaped her days. Oars dipped, water parted, passengers arrived and departed. The river was constant in movement, and so was she. One winter, however, grief entered her life like a sudden storm. Her younger brother, who had often helped her repair nets and mend ropes, fell ill unexpectedly and passed within weeks. The house grew quiet. The dock felt empty. As Mina continued ferrying villagers across the river, she felt as though something inside her had been carved away. She rowed in silence. Passengers spoke softly out of respect, but within her grief echoed. At night, she sat by the window overlooking the river and replayed memories. His laughter, his voice calling her name, the way he would steady the boat when wind grew strong. Each memory felt sharp. She began to think of herself differently. "I am the one who lost him," she whispered to herself. Grief became part of her identity. She did not resist it, but she felt defined by it. One fog-heavy morning, as she guided the boat through thick mist, a young passenger asked innocently, "Do you ever get tired of crossing the same river every day?" Mina considered the question. "The river is never the same," she replied quietly. The child looked confused. "It looks the same," he said. She dipped her oar into the water. "The surface may look familiar," she answered, "but the current is always moving." As the boat reached the opposite bank, her words lingered in her own mind. The river changes every moment, and yet it remains the river. That evening, sitting alone once more, she watched the water glide beneath fading light. Grief moved through her like a current, some days strong, some days gentle. But something noticed the grief. Something was aware of the ache in her chest, the heaviness in her breath. That awareness did not feel broken. It did not feel diminished. It simply held the sorrow as the riverbed holds the flowing water. For the first time since her brother's passing, Mina sensed that loss had changed her life, but it had not erased the simple presence that had always known joy, laughter, and now grief. The river continued moving, and she continued rowing. In the days that followed, Mina began to notice the river more closely than before, not as background to her sorrow, but as teacher. She watched how fallen leaves were carried downstream without resistance. She observed how branches caught briefly on stones, then loosened and continued on their way. She saw how morning mist obscured the far bank only to dissolve when sunlight warmed the surface. Grief, she realized, moved in a similar way. Some mornings it rose suddenly thick and heavy like fog. Other days it thinned almost transparent, but always it moved. One afternoon, as she waited for passengers to board, an elderly monk approached the dock. He stepped carefully into the boat and sat opposite her. They crossed in silence for several moments before he spoke. "You row with great steadiness," he observed. Mina gave a small nod. "I have done it all my life." The monk studied her face. "You carry sorrow," he said gently. She did not deny it. "Yes. Does the sorrow row the boat?" She frowned slightly. "No. Does it move your arms?" "No. Does it steer?" She looked down at the oars cutting through water. "No," she said quietly. The monk nodded. "Sorrow is a current," he continued. "But you are not the current." They reached the opposite bank. Before stepping out, he added softly, "Notice what remains when the wave passes." That evening, Mina sat again by her window. She did not push away memory. She allowed it to rise. She remembered her brother's laughter. Tears formed and slipped quietly down her cheeks. The ache returned familiar sharp, but alongside the ache there was noticing. There was awareness of the tightness in her chest, awareness of breath catching, awareness of tears cooling against her skin. The sorrow moved, the awareness did not. She closed her eyes. Without the story, without the image of the past, what was present? There was sensation, there was breathing, there was simple being. Grief belonged to the story of her life, but awareness belonged to something deeper, something that had known childhood joy, adult responsibility, and now loss. The river outside continued its endless motion. It did not hold yesterday's water, yet it remained the river. Mina understood now that she could grieve fully without being reduced to grief. She could remember without being trapped in memory. She could love without fearing that love's loss would define her forever. The next morning, when she untied the boat from the dock, her movements felt lighter. The ache had not vanished, but it no longer felt like her identity. It was a wave, and beneath it, steady, silent, vast, was the open awareness in which all waves rose and fell. And perhaps, like Mina, we believe loss reshapes us permanently. Yet beneath every sorrow, beneath every joy, there is something unchanged. Not cold, not distant, but quietly present. Let us now meet someone who believed guilt and had sealed her identity until she discovered that even the heaviest burden cannot stain what she truly is. In a hillside town where narrow paths wound between stone houses, there lived a woman named Parry. For more than 30 years, Parry carried a secret she believed had defined her forever. When she was young, in a moment of anger and pride, she had spoken harsh words to her closest friend. The argument had ended abruptly. Days later, before reconciliation could happen, her friend left the town unexpectedly and never returned. No farewell, no apology, only silence. Over time, Pari convinced herself that her words had caused the separation. I drove her away, she would whisper in the privacy of her home. The sentence repeated so often that it hardened into identity. I am the one who ruined something precious. Years passed. Pari married, she worked, she laughed with neighbors. But beneath every ordinary day, guilt lingered like a quiet shadow. When happiness appeared, a voice inside her would say, "You do not deserve this." When someone praised her kindness, she would think, if they knew the truth, they could not speak so gently. The event itself had grown distant in detail, but the feeling remained vivid. One autumn, after decades of carrying this weight, Pari visited a nearby monastery, seeking relief. She did not expect forgiveness. She did not expect absolution. She simply wanted the heaviness to loosen. An elderly monk received her in a small courtyard shaded by bamboo. She bowed deeply. "I have done something I cannot undo," she said. The monk listened without interruption as she described the argument from long ago, the raised voice, the cut-in remark, the unfinished apology. When she finished, tears clung to her lashes. "I have carried this for 30 years, she said. The monk nodded slowly. "Where is it now?" he asked. She blinked. "In my heart," she replied. He shook his head gently. "Show it to me." She pressed her hand to her chest. "It is here," she insisted. He studied her carefully. "Close your eyes," he said. She obeyed. Without the story, he continued softly, without the image of the past. "What do you find right now?" Pari hesitated. There was tightness, there was warmth behind her eyes. There was breath moving in and out. "And what knows that tightness?" he asked. She remained silent. Something was aware of the sensation. Something was noticing the ache. "Does that awareness feel stained?" he asked quietly. Her brow furrowed. She looked inward more carefully. The guilt felt heavy, but the awareness observing it felt clear, untouched. For a moment, confusion replaced sorrow. If guilt had been with her for decades, yet awareness remained unchanged. Then what exactly had been defined? The monk's voice was gentle. "A memory is like ink on paper," he said. "It can describe regret. It can describe pain." He paused. "But the paper itself is not burned by the ink." Pari opened her eyes slowly. The courtyard looked the same. Bamboo leaves swayed lightly in the breeze. Her life had not been erased, but something subtle had shifted. Perhaps guilt was not her identity. Perhaps it was a chapter, and perhaps the one who read that chapter had always remained unstained. Pari remained seated in the courtyard. Long after the monk fell silent, the afternoon light shifted across the stone tiles. A bird landed briefly on the bamboo railing, then lifted away again. She closed her eyes once more. The memory returned easily, her younger self standing, rigid voice, sharp pride, refusing to soften. For years, she had replayed the scene with a single conclusion: I am the one who caused harm. But now, instead of following the story, she examined the present moment. There was pressure in her chest. There was moisture gathering in her eyes. There was a tightening in her throat, and there was awareness of all of it. The monk's question echoed gently within her. Does that awareness feel stained? She searched carefully. The sensations felt heavy. The thoughts felt painful, but the awareness noticing them felt open, clear. It did not accuse. It did not defend. It did not justify. It simply knew. For decades, she had mistaken the voice of guilt for her own identity. She had believed that because regret appeared again and again. It must be what she truly was. Yet now she began to see that regret was like weather, sometimes fierce, sometimes quiet, always moving across a sky that remained untouched. She opened her eyes and looked at the monk. "If awareness is untouched," she asked softly, "does that mean what I did does not matter?" The monk shook his head. "Actions matter," he said gently. "Consequences matter. Regret can teach humility." He paused. But identity is not the same as action. He picked up a fallen bamboo leaf and held it between his fingers. "This leaf may fall into mud," he said. "Mud may cling to it." He let it drop. But the sky above does not become muddy. Pari felt tears fall freely now. Not from shame, but from relief. She had carried guilt as proof of loyalty to her lost friend, as if releasing it would mean forgetting. But awareness did not erase memory. It held memory gently without becoming it. For the first time in 30 years, she allowed the story to be just that, a story. Painful, human, but not the definition of her being. In the weeks that followed, she noticed subtle changes. When the memory arose, she did not push it away. She observed it. There was sorrow, there was tenderness, and beneath both there was steady presence. She even found herself speaking her friend's name aloud again, not with self-punishment, but with gratitude for the time they had shared. The guilt no longer felt like a brand burned into her identity. It felt like a scar, evidence of something lived, but not a wound that defined her forever. One evening, as she walked home from the monastery, she looked up at the open sky. Clouds moved slowly across it, some dark, some bright. But the sky itself remained vast and unmarked, and she understood. She could take responsibility without becoming condemnation. She could remember without becoming regret. She could change without denying the past. Because what she truly was had never been stained. And perhaps, like Pari, we believe our mistakes have sealed our identity. Yet even the heaviest guilt appears within awareness, and awareness itself remains clear. Let us now meet someone who believed that history defined reality until he discovered that records are not the same as truth itself. In a grand stone building at the center of an old city, there worked a historian named Tam. Tam devoted his life to records. Ancient manuscripts filled the archives he supervised. Shelves stretched upward like silent witnesses to centuries of wars, treaties, births, discoveries, and forgotten names. He believed history was the foundation of identity. Without record, he often said, memory dissolves. Without documentation, truth becomes fragile. Tam spent long hours restoring faded scrolls, comparing dates, correcting minor inconsistencies in official accounts. He found comfort in chronology. If something could be placed in sequence, it could be understood. Visitors admired his dedication. "Because of you, one official told him our past will never be lost." Tam bowed politely. Secretly, he felt pride. To preserve history was to preserve reality itself, or so he believed. One summer evening, however, disaster struck. A small fire began in a neighboring building. Carried by wind and neglect, it spread faster than anyone anticipated. By the time smoke reached the archive halls, flames were already pressing against wooden beams. Tam rushed inside, despite warnings. He tried to gather as many manuscripts as he could carry. Scrolls tumbled from shelves. Ash drifted downward like dark snow. The heat forced him back before he could save even a fraction of what he intended. By dawn, Much of the archive lay in ruin. Centuries of record reduced to charred fragments. Tam stood outside the blackened building, hands trembling. The loss felt immeasurable. Names erased, dates dissolved, stories broken mid-sentence. For days he walked among the debris in silence. He felt as though part of himself had burned with the papers. If history could vanish so quickly, what anchored reality? Had truth been destroyed with ink and parchment? One afternoon, a young student approached him carefully. "Master Tam," the student asked, "are the events themselves gone?" Tam looked at him sharply. "What do you mean? The wars, the lives, the moments, those scrolls described," the student continued. "Did they disappear when the paper burned?" Tam hesitated. "Of course not." The past had already unfolded. The fire had consumed records, not the events themselves. The student spoke again. "If the record is not the event, then what have we lost?" Tam stood very still. He had spent his life equating documentation with truth. But now, he saw something subtle. A map is not the territory. A record is not the living moment. The manuscripts had preserved descriptions, but they had never contained reality itself. That night, sitting alone beside the ruins, Tam closed his eyes. He imagined a moment from history, a king signing a treaty centuries ago. The paper describing that event was gone. Yet the event had existed, and awareness now could still imagine it, contemplate it, reflect upon it. Records pointed, but awareness was immediate. He began to wonder whether he had mistaken preservation for presence, whether he had confused written memory with living truth. And in the quiet darkness, a realization began to take shape. Perhaps what is real does not depend entirely on what is recorded. In the weeks that followed, Tam returned each morning to the ruined archive. Where towering shelves had once stood, there were now blackened frames and scattered fragments of parchment. At first, he felt only absence. Names once carefully preserved had dissolved into ash. Chronologies he had memorized no longer existed in tangible form. He knelt and lifted a charred scrap of paper. The ink had blurred beyond recognition. For years he had believed that without such pages, truth would be lost. But as he held the fragment in his hand, a quiet question emerged. Was truth ever contained in the paper itself? Or had the paper merely pointed toward something that had already lived and passed? One afternoon, the same young student approached him again. "Master," the student said gently, "will you rebuild the archive?" Tam looked across the open space where the building once stood. "Yes," he answered slowly. "We will gather what remains. We will restore what we can." He paused. "But I no longer believe that history rests only on shelves." The student waited. Tam continued. "When I was young, I saw that if we could preserve every detail, we could secure reality itself." He let the charred fragment fall back to the ground. But reality has always been immediate. The scroll describes the treaty. It is not the signing. The manuscript recounts a life. It is not the living. That evening, Tam walked through the city streets observing ordinary life. Children laughed near fountains. Merchants argued over prices. An old woman fed birds in the square. None of these moments were being recorded, yet they were undeniably real. He realized that awareness did not require documentation to know what was happening. The mind could reflect, but presence was prior to record. Back at the ruins, Tam sat upon a stone step and closed his eyes. Memories of the archive surfaced, the quiet hum of study, The careful turning of pages, the satisfaction of preserving ancient ink. He felt sorrow for what had been lost. But beneath sorrow there was noticing, awareness of grief, awareness of thought, awareness of the simple fact of sitting there beneath an open sky. The fire had burned paper, it had not burned awareness, and awareness was the only place in which history, memory, and present life could appear at all. When reconstruction began, Tam worked diligently. He cataloged surviving fragments. He invited scholars to contribute copies from distant collections. He supervised the rebuilding of stone walls. But something in him had shifted. He no longer felt that reality depended on his efforts. Records mattered, but they were maps. And a map is useful precisely because there is a living landscape beneath it. One evening, as the first restored manuscripts were placed upon new shelves, Tam stood quietly and bowed not to the paper, but to the open awareness in which past and present loss and restoration all unfolded. And perhaps, like Tam, we cling to stories, records, histories, believing they define what is real. Yet before any story is written, there is presence, and after every page has turned to ash, there is still awareness. Let us now meet someone who feared forgetting herself entirely, until she discovered that even memories fading cannot erase what she truly is. In a quiet neighborhood where cherry trees lined narrow streets, there lived an elderly woman named Seki. In her youth, Seki had been known for her remarkable memory. She could recall long poems after hearing them only once. She remembered the birthdays of distant relatives, the smallest details of conversations decades old, the exact shade of the sky on important days of her life. People admired this gift. "You never forget," they would say with affection. For many years, Seki quietly believed that memory was the thread that held her identity together. Her memories were proof of continuity. They confirmed who she had been, who she had loved, what she had endured. But as she entered her late 70s, something began to change. At first it was subtle, a misplaced key, a forgotten name that returned minutes later. A moment of hesitation before recalling a familiar address. She brushed it aside. Everyone forgets sometimes, she told herself. Yet the lapses became more frequent. One afternoon, she stood in her kitchen staring at a kettle on the stove, unable to remember whether she had already added tea leaves. Another day, she paused mid-sentence while speaking to a neighbor, her mind suddenly blank. Fear crept in quietly. If memory faded, what would remain of her? She began to test herself in secret, reciting poems from childhood, listing family members in order of birth, replaying events from decades ago. When she stumbled, panic rose in her chest. "I am disappearing," she whispered one evening as she sat alone by the window. The idea terrified her. Her memories had felt like possessions, treasures carefully stored. Without them, would she still be herself? One day her granddaughter visited and found her staring at an old photograph. "Do you remember this?" the girl asked gently. Seki looked closely. The image showed her standing beside her late husband under blooming cherry blossoms. She recognized her own face, but the details of that specific day felt distant. "I remember loving him," she said softly. "But I cannot remember what we said." The granddaughter squeezed her hand. "That's okay," she replied. But Seki did not feel okay. That evening, unable to sleep, she lay in bed and watched shadows shift across the ceiling. She tried to recall the exact words of her wedding vows. Nothing came. Tears formed quietly. If even sacred moments could fade, what anchored her existence? As she lay there, something simple occurred. She noticed the sensation of breath moving in and out. She noticed the feeling of the pillow beneath her head. She noticed the faint ticking of a clock in the next room. All of it was immediate. She did not need memory to know these things. Awareness was present without effort. The thought came gently, almost like a whisper. Before I remembered my life, I was here. Before I knew names and dates, I was here. Even now, as memory shifts and fades, I am here. The realization did not erase her fear entirely, but it softened its edges. Perhaps memory was not the root of identity. Perhaps memory was a collection of stories moving within something deeper, something that did not depend on recollection to exist. She closed her eyes and rested not in past images, but in simple presence. And for the first time since forgetting had begun, she felt a quiet steadiness beneath the uncertainty. In the weeks that followed, Seki's memory continued to shift in unpredictable ways. Some mornings she awoke clear and sharp, able to recount stories from childhood with surprising detail. Other days, familiar names hovered just beyond reach. At first, each lapse felt like a small disappearance. But gradually she began to experiment with something different. Instead of reaching desperately into the past, she turned her attention to what was present. When a name would not come, she noticed the sensation of searching. When a date felt blurred, she noticed the slight tension in her brow. When confusion arose, she noticed the feeling of uncertainty itself. In every case, there was awareness of the experience. One afternoon, she sat in the garden beneath blooming cherry blossoms. Petals drifted down around her, landing softly in her lap. She could not remember the year she and her husband first planted the tree, but she could feel the warmth of sunlight on her hands. She could see the pale pink of the petals against the blue sky. She could hear distant laughter from children playing nearby. Life was happening directly. Memory was not required for presence. Her granddaughter joined her quietly and rested her head against Seki's shoulder. "Are you thinking about Grandpa?" she asked. Seki paused. "I don't remember what he said to me the last time we sat here," she admitted. She placed her hand over her heart. "But I remember loving him." Then she smiled gently, "And I feel that love even now." In that moment, she saw something clearly. Love was not stored only in memory. It lived in presence. Even when specific stories faded, the simple capacity to feel remained. That evening, as twilight settled across the neighborhood, she stood before the mirror in her bedroom. For a brief second, she felt disoriented. The reflection seemed both familiar and strange. But then she noticed something beyond appearance. There was seeing. There was awareness of the face in the mirror. The features had changed across decades. Memory of younger versions of herself came and went. Yet the awareness looking through her eyes felt untouched by age or forgetting. She whispered softly, "Even if I forget everything, this remains." She did not mean the body. She did not mean the story. She meant the simple knowing of being here. In the months that followed, her memory continued its gentle unraveling. Some days she asked the same question twice. Some evenings she misplaced objects she had just held. But those who sat with her noticed something surprising. She was calmer than before, less afraid. When confusion appeared, She did not panic as she once had. She rested in the immediate experience, the feel of breath, the warmth of tea in her hands, the sound of wind moving through branches. The past no longer anchored her identity. Presence did, and perhaps, like Seki, we fear that forgetting will erase us. We cling to memory as proof of existence, yet before memory formed, there was awareness. And even when memory fades, awareness remains. Let us now meet someone who searched for awakening for decades until he discovered that what he sought had never been absent. In a remote mountain monastery, where clouds drifted low against stone walls, there lived a monk named Tu. Tu had entered the monastery at the age of 20. He had come with a single, burning question. How do I awaken? From the beginning, he was diligent. He rose before dawn. He meditated longer than required. He memorized teachings with unwavering focus. While other novices laughed quietly during chores, Tu remained serious. He believed enlightenment was something to attain, a distant summit visible only after years of effort. His teachers admired his discipline. Continue, they would say. Do not lose heart. And Tu did not. Years passed. He sat through winter cold that numbed his legs. He endured summer heat that drenched his robes in sweat. He practiced walking meditation until each step felt measured and precise. He studied koan's paradoxical questions, meant to pierce the thinking mind. What is your original face before your parents were born? He repeated the question silently for months. He analyzed it. He wrestled with it. He waited for a breakthrough, but nothing dramatic occurred. At 35, he felt frustrated. At 40, he felt quietly ashamed. You have practiced for 20 years, he told himself. Why are you not awakened? He began comparing himself to others. A younger monk claimed to have experienced profound clarity during meditation. An older master spoke of insight as natural as breathing. Tu felt left behind. Perhaps I am not worthy, he thought. Perhaps I lack something essential. One evening, unable to contain his discouragement, he approached the abbot. I have practiced for decades, Tu said, bowing deeply. I have disciplined my body and mind, yet I remain ordinary. When will awakening come? The abbot regarded him quietly. When did you begin seeking? The abbot asked. At 20, Tu replied, and before that Tu frowned. I did not seek before that. The abbot nodded slowly. And before you sought, were you absent? Tu hesitated. No. The abbot leaned slightly forward. The one who seeks awakening, he said gently, is the same one who was present before seeking began. Tu felt confusion rise. But I do not feel awakened, he protested. The abbot smiled faintly. You are looking for fireworks, he said. You are waiting for something extraordinary. He paused. But what if what you seek is the very awareness in which this question appears? That night, Tu returned to the meditation hall. He sat as he had sat thousands of times before. Breath in, breath out. But instead of striving toward a future realization, he asked himself quietly. Right now, what is missing? Thoughts arose. Doubts surfaced. Expectations flickered. He noticed them. The noticing was effortless. He did not create awareness. It was already present. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to stop searching for a different state. He did not try to deepen concentration. He did not chase insight. He simply rested in the awareness that had been present in every meditation session since youth. In the stillness, something subtle shifted. Not an explosion, not a vision, but a quiet recognition. The one who had been striving for awakening had always been the awareness he sought. Yet the habit of seeking had obscured what was simple. He opened his eyes slowly. The meditation hall looked unchanged. Candlelight flickered against stone walls. The wind brushed softly against wooden beams. Nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet something fundamental felt different. He had been looking outward, even inward, for an object called awakening. But awareness was not an object. It was the field in which all objects appeared. For decades, he had been like someone searching for his own eyes. And perhaps like two, we search tirelessly for fulfillment, clarity, awakening, believing they lie somewhere ahead. Yet what we seek may be closer than thought itself, closer than effort, closer than the one who seeks. In the days that followed, Tu continued his practice as before. He rose before dawn. He bowed before entering the meditation hall. He sat cross-legged on the same worn cushion. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inwardly, striving had softened. When thoughts arose, am I progressing? Is this it? He noticed them without urgency. The noticing itself felt steady. He began to see clearly that every experience of the past 20 years had appeared within the same awareness. Moments of frustration, moments of calm, moments of doubt, moments of clarity. All of them had come and gone. Awareness had not. One afternoon, while sweeping fallen leaves from the monastery courtyard, Tu felt the familiar rhythm of movement, broom against stone leaves gathering in small arcs. Suddenly he laughed softly. For decades he had treated awakening as a distant event. Yet here was simple seeing, simple hearing, simple movement, nothing missing. He paused mid-sweep, the sound of wind in the trees, the sensation of the broom handle in his hands, the warmth of sunlight on his face. All of it appeared effortlessly. There was no boundary between seeker and sought. The one who had searched was simply a thought appearing within awareness, and awareness did not need to become awakened. It was already awake. Later, he approached the abbot once more. "I think I understand," Tu said quietly. The abbot raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Tu smiled. "There is no one who becomes awakened," he said. "There is only awakening itself." The abbot nodded gently. "Do not turn it into a conclusion," he replied. "Simply live it." Tu bowed. From that day forward, he continued practicing, not to achieve something, but as an expression of what had always been present. When younger monks approached him with questions about enlightenment, he did not offer complex explanations. He would ask instead, "Right now, are you aware?" They would nod. And as that awareness need improvement, they would hesitate. Tu would smile. Notice that. He no longer compared himself to others. He no longer measured progress. Seeking had dissolved into simple being. And, perhaps, like Tu, we spend years striving toward a future version of ourselves, more peaceful, more awakened, more complete. Yet what we long for may not be an achievement at all. It may be the quiet awareness in which longing appears, not distant, not hidden, already here. Let us now follow one final journey, the journey of someone who searched the world for meaning, only to discover that home had never been elsewhere. In a distant province, far from the monastery and the riverside villages, there lived a traveler named Kato. From a young age, Kato had felt restless. While others in his town seemed content with familiar routines, he sensed that something essential was missing. He believed meaning lay somewhere beyond the horizon. So he left. He crossed mountains wrapped in mist. He walked through cities, crowded with noise. He studied with teachers who spoke of destiny, fate, discipline, devotion. Each time he thought he had found the answer, satisfaction faded. He would remain in one place for months, sometimes years, absorbing new philosophies, new practices, new identities. Yet eventually, a quiet dissatisfaction returned. "This is not it," he would whisper to himself. He became known as a seeker, a pilgrim of ideas, a collector of experiences. He wore many roles over the decades: disciple, merchant, hermit, student of sacred texts. With each new beginning, he felt hope. With each departure, he felt subtle disappointment. Years turned into decades. His hair grew streaked with gray, his steps slowed. Yet the restlessness remained. One winter evening, after nearly 20 years of wandering, Kodo found himself back near the edge of his childhood town. He had not planned to return, but the road had curved unexpectedly, and his body, tired from travel, welcomed familiarity. He stood on a hill, overlooking the small cluster of houses where he had grown up. Smoke rose from chimneys. The old oak tree still stood near the well. He felt a strange mixture of comfort and embarrassment. Had he traveled the world only to arrive where he began? As dusk settled, he walked slowly toward his former home. The house had aged. Paint peeled from wooden beams. The gate creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the rooms felt smaller than he remembered. He sat down in the empty main room and closed his eyes. Memories rose naturally. As a child, he had sat in this very space, staring at sunlight patterns on the floor. He had felt curiosity then, a sense of wonder, not yet shaped into a quest. Before the desire to seek meaning, there had been simple presence. Before he believed something was missing, there had been wholeness he did not question. He laughed softly. All his travels had been an attempt to recover what he imagined he lacked. But sitting there in the quiet house, he noticed something undeniable. Awareness was here. The same awareness that had watched mountain sunrises. The same awareness that had listened to distant teachers. The same awareness that had felt both hope and disappointment. Nothing about that awareness had changed. He had searched landscapes. He had searched teachings. He had searched identities. Yet what he had sought was the simple presence that had accompanied him everywhere. The journey had not been wrong, but the destination had never been elsewhere. As night deepened around him, Kodo rested in stillness. No more striving, no more comparison. Just the quiet awareness that had been present before the first step of the journey, and that would remain long after the final step was taken. Kodo remained in the old house through the night. Wind moved softly against the walls. Floorboards creaked in familiar rhythm. He did not light a candle. He did not rehearse philosophies gathered from distant teachers. He simply sat. At first, thoughts returned out of habit. "You have wasted years. You should have understood sooner." He noticed them. They rose and faded like every other thought he had ever encountered. The same awareness that had once chased insight now watched regret without resistance. As dawn approached, pale light slipped through the worn shutters. Dust drifted in golden beams. He remembered himself as a child sitting in that same light, tracing shapes on the floor with his fingers. There had been no spiritual ambition then, no longing for enlightenment. Only simple seeing, simple being. He saw clearly now that the search had been built upon an assumption that something essential was missing. But what had been missing? Every experience of the past 20 years, confusion, devotion, disappointment, wonder had unfolded within awareness. Awareness had never departed. It had not grown stronger in monasteries. It had not weakened in cities. It had not improved through effort. It had simply been present. He stood and walked outside. The town was just waking. A woman swept her doorway. A baker opened shutters. A child chased a stray dog across the square. Life continued in ordinary rhythm. Nothing mystical, nothing dramatic. And yet everything appeared luminous in its simplicity. Koto felt no urge to leave again, not because he had found final answers, but because he no longer believed fulfillment lived elsewhere. The journey had brought him back to what had always been here. Home was not a location. It was the awareness in which all locations appeared. Years later, when people asked him about his travels, he would smile and say only I went far in order to discover what was near. He did not dismiss the path he had walked. It had taught humility. It had revealed restlessness. It had exposed longing. But the end of seeking was not the acquisition of something new. It was the recognition of what had never been absent. And perhaps, like Koto, we believe that meaning lies somewhere ahead in achievement, in understanding, in distant horizons. Yet every step of the search unfolds within awareness. The traveler and the path appear within it. The longing and its fulfillment arise within it. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing essential is missing. And so our journey through these stories comes gently to rest. From record keepers to gardeners, from bell makers to monks, from historians to wanderers, each believed identity was built from name, skill, memory, guilt age, or achievement. And each discovered something quieter. Before the name, before the role, before the story, there is simple awareness, unwritten, unstained, unbroken. Here, now, let everything soften. The stories have ended. The seeker has stopped searching. The traveler has come home. The gardener has released control. The monk has stopped striving. And you do not need to understand anything more tonight. Let the words fade. Let the ideas dissolve. There is nothing to achieve in this moment, nothing to fix, nothing to become. Just notice the quiet presence that has been here through every story. The same awareness that listened is the same awareness that now grows heavier with rest. Feel your breathing, slow, natural, unforced. Each inhale arriving by itself. Each exhale releasing the day. You do not need to hold on to any teaching. You do not need to remember any lesson. Like leaves drifting across a river, the stories can float away now. What remains is simple. You are here, aware and safe. If these quiet journeys have brought you peace, if they have helped you feel less alone in your searching, you are always welcome here. This is the long night, a place where stories slow the mind and stillness becomes your companion. If you would like to continue walking these gentle paths together, you can subscribe and return whenever the world feels loud or restless. But for now, there is nothing to do. No next chapter, no further seeking. Let your body grow heavy. Let your thoughts become distant. Let awareness remain without effort. The night is wide, the air is calm, and you may rest completely within it. Sleep deeply, sleep peacefully, and know that what you truly are has never been separate from this quiet stillness. Good night.